called Writing the History of Post-War Housing Complexes and Neighborhoods, which, let me remind this to you, is organized jointly by the Cost Action European Middle Class Mass Housing, which is this European action, and a doctoral program based in Torino, which is the PhD program in Architecture, History and Project, which means that the public presently attending this lecture is made up, I would say, in equal parts of researchers and scholars interested in this COST project on the one hand, and PhD students from the Politecnico di Torino on the other hand, many of which are working on 20th century history topics and in some cases on housing history topics. I leave it up to Gaia to say a few words about why we decided to settle with this title and to propose this seminar to both the PhD program and the COST action.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Filippo. Thank you to all of you, our PhD students registered in the course and our colleagues from the COST network to be here today. We are extremely sorry and worried about the talk by Miles, because we, as Filippo anticipated, we agreed yesterday to try the presentation at 2:30. So our hope is that in 10 minutes he will, that there was a misunderstanding and that in 10 minutes he will show up. In the other case, we will introduce the lecture series and the PhD course. And we will be forced to reschedule the talk by Miles. As Filippo said, these initiatives, this lecture series is a shared effort between the COST action titled European Middle Class Mass Housing, chaired by Anna Vaz Milero, a network where we are all involved with Filippo and with many of the colleagues who are here today. And our PhD program in Architecture, History and Project, and in particular the course that in the last year with Filippo we coordinated within the program devoted to historical studies on housing. The title we selected this year, that is Writing the History of Post-War Housing Complexes and Neighborhoods, had a special focus, a special attention devoted to the research practice, the research strategies and research methodologies. So we found interesting to propose also within the COST action a special focus, a cycle of communications that in some way investigated the recent trends in the historical studies on housing in relation to the investigation on mass housing built for the middle class in the post-war period in Europe, in order to have through these four talks, through four interventions, an insight of diverse approaches, diverse strategies, and also by colleagues who in the past decade published studies and developed research coming from different fields, but that in some way changed the panorama of the studies, the historical studies on housing. In our program, we planned 4 talks. The first, the one scheduled today by Miles Glendinning, who is the director of the Scottish Centre for Conservation Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Next week, we have scheduled a talk by our colleague Sandra Parvou, who is a researcher at the ENSA Paris Val de Seine, but is also a member of the Laboratoire Architecture Anthropologie at Paris La Villette. Then we will have on September 23, the third Wednesday, the talk by Yael Alway, who is the head of the housing lab at Technion, titled History of Future, called The History of Future of Living. And then we will conclude with the fourth intervention, the fourth communication by a friend, a colleague, Inge Daniels, who is an anthropologist. He's based at the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Oxford. So these four talks had the aim in some way to provide different approaches, a selection of different approaches, different research strategies, different studies, also interweaving the methods, the practice, and the sources coming from different fields, showing how historical studies on middle-class mass housing can become really an interesting also ground for experimenting these forms of contamination between different research approaches, research strategies, and methodologies. We also scheduled the final meeting, as you can see from the program, that it's only devoted to our PhD students, and then Filippo now will also introduce the aim of this series in the frame of our PhD course on history of housing, where we will have the occasion to discuss these four interventions through a specific seminar devoted to the students. I have also to add, I would like to add that these initiatives first emerged when we already hoped to have our COST meeting in Milan during the month of November. We had scheduled 4 intense days of meetings, discussions, field trips that unfortunately, due to the circumstances, will not take place. We hope to be able to propose the same format for the meeting in February. And so this is a way to, in some way, involve our PhD students in what we have originally conceived as a master class for the action for the COST meeting to be held in Milan in November. So I thank all our colleagues from the networks who are here today, hoping to be able to start the talk by Miles Glendinning in a few minutes. I don't know, Filippo, if you want to add something concerning the PhD course.
Yeah, just taking the word to well, to remind that the general idea behind this series of lectures and a number of other initiatives taken within this COST action is that historical studies on 20th century housing can be taken as an interesting observation point for measuring a number of innovations and deviations that are happening in the fields of architectural history and the social history of the built environment. So the idea is to use historical housing studies as a testing ground in order to measure the ways in which approaches to the historical study of the built environment in general is changing. Which is why we have proposed this series of lectures to both the members of the COST action and to the PhD students of the Architectural History and Design program at the Politecnico di Torino, because we believe the topic can be good for both a dialogue between practitioners and scholars already working in the field, on the one hand, and PhD students on the other hand, many of which are intent in reflecting upon methodologies, strategies, and approaches in their own research practice, be it not related to housing history. So I'm now briefly turning to some notes that are more, let's say, addressed to the PhD students of the Politecnico di Torino, which are now connected for them also. This is the first meeting of this online course. As Guy had already told, our initial plan, both for this course and for this conference series, was very different. When we planned to have something at this time of the year a few years ago, that was before the pandemic, we thought that a full-fledged meeting of the cost action would have taken place in Milan. The idea was to organize a series of activities around this plenary meeting of the cost action, and these activities would have included a PhD seminar revolving around some of the topics that were meant to be under discussion. This is no time for large meetings in person, not yet. We hope these times to return soon, really, because especially for the cost action, that would be essential for the good advancement of the project. But the formula that we have chosen for the PhD course is still very useful, I think, and very interesting to follow. Now, we have Miles Glendinning there. We have good news here.
Hello.
Okay. Miles.
Hi.
How are you? Hi.
In the meetings.
Hi.
Sorry about that. Sorry about the misunderstanding.
I'm really sorry. There was a misunderstanding concerning
Oh dear.
the important things that we already introduced the seminar, the series of talks. So we are ready. If we share the screen and we
I just can I just go through and get my stuff then?
Of
Sorry,
course.
Absolutely.
I was kind of expecting to have about 5 minutes.
Filippo concluded the presentation and introduced your.
Yeah. So we can confirm to everyone that Miles Glendining's lecture will start within a few minutes. It was quite easy to guess that actually this was the reason why things were not starting at the right time. Anyway, just to conclude my brief presentation for the PhD students, one important thing that PhD students need to know is that, as you have seen from the calendar that Gaia projected a few moments ago, for PhD students of the Politecnico di Torino, the course will be made up of the 4 lectures that we have programmed, but also of a final seminar, which is scheduled, as you can see, for October 7. This final seminar is only dedicated to the PhD students of the Politecnico di Torino, and that will be a moment of summing up of all the materials that we will have gathered during this course. We will send to all the participants an email over the next few days with the details for the preparation of the seminar. But the general idea is that before this final seminar, all of you will have to prepare a presentation accompanied by a short written documents that will make sense of the 4 approaches that we have heard about. We'll also distribute a number of texts among PhD students that are coming from the from our 4 guests here. So you will have additional written materials in addition to the registration of these conferences and to the notes you will have taken during the presentations. You are encouraged from this very moment to actually take active part in the discussion following the lectures, but there will be a moment of final discussion with us that will be supported by some written materials that we will ask you to prepare before that. Do we have anything to add about this, Gaia?
No, I think it's important to highlight that we will share in a few days at least 1 article written by each of the speakers in relation to their research, focusing in particular on their research methodologies and approaches, and that can constitute with the registration of the talk of these 4 lectures, the materials that you can use to prepare these brief critical notes concerning the 4 approaches. At the same time, I would like to say that all these talks are framed in 2 parts, in 2 modules. We asked our guests to have around a 1-hour talk in order to then have the possibility to have a debate, to dedicate some time to the discussion between our guests, our colleagues, members of the COST networks, and our PhD students and scholars. Okay, so Filippo, if you want to introduce Mai, we can share we can try to share the screen in the meantime.
So should I try and get my PowerPoint up just now then? And okay, right. Sorry, I just didn't even occur to me about the timing thing. I kind of
Filippo can introduce yourself
Yep.
in the meantime. Yeah. Don't worry, you can prepare
Okay.
the PowerPoint, try to share.
So thank you, Miles, for being here. We are really sorry about this misunderstanding of which we are most probably guilty. So you still have a few seconds to prepare for this lecture. But I can take just a minute to introduce you to the virtual audience of this lecture. Actually, there is no. I don't think there is a real need to present you, but this is part of the ritual, let's say.
Yes.
So Miles Glendinning holds a chair in architectural conservation at the Edinburgh College of Art of the University of Edinburgh, and is also the director of the Scottish Centre for Conservation Studies. And most of his work revolves around the history and the documentation of 20th century mass housing and the number of conservation issues related to 20th century architecture. His many books include a book called Tower Block, Modern Public Housing in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, written with Stefan Muthesius and published, I guess, in 1994. Correct me if I'm wrong, Miles. Then a history of the conservation movement, a history of architectural preservation published in 2013 by Bloomsbury, and the upcoming publication of a book called Mass Housing, Modern Architecture and State Power, which a book that presents itself as a global history of mass housing, and which I understand will be one of the centers of today's speech. Thanks once again, Miles, for being here with us.
Great. Okay. Could I just check that you can see my screen and everything's in order? Can you see the screen just now?
Not yet.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I've how do I go about sharing it? I've got it up now. What do I do to share it? Possibly, I wonder whether an option might be to for you to use the version that I emailed to you. I don't know whether you've got that on hand. It's a slightly lower resolution one, or
I think Gaia might try to share her screen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just loading Teams. Yeah, yes. So is this meeting a Teams? I mean, I just clicked on the link that you supplied, so I kind of not quite sure how to go about sharing. I mean, I've got the full screen up just now on my laptop, and I've got the text here, so I'm kind of ready to go. What would be the best?
Okay, I can see your screen, I guess.
You can see it, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what should I do to?
Could you make it full screen? That would possibly be.
How about, right? Let's just.
Possibly the top right button there.
Right. Well, there's this button which is to restore down. I wonder whether maybe you could try the full screen thing at the top of your. I mean, there's I can see a screen there with captions in Italian. So maybe if you could try clicking on the top right, there's
maybe that's the Gaia screen. Yeah.
You think that
Gaia, we cannot hear you.
Okay. So Miles, if you can try here with the screen and the arrow now to share, can we try?
What? Well, I can't see it. I can't see the screen at all now.
If not, I can share your presentation if you prefer.
I think that might be a better thing. Yeah, I think otherwise I'm gonna.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So now you can see.
Right.
Presentazione. Okay.
Right. And now, do I have control over the pages, or would I need to say to you,
Yeah,
next
you need
slide?
to say this is the problem. If I share the screen, you have to tell me when I have to
That's
change.
fine. I think that's fine. Let's go with that, because I think otherwise we're going to get lost in different screens. So, okay. Well, I'd like to talk today about two highly contrasting research and book projects. Firstly, this global history of mass housing that's going to be published by Bloomsbury Academic early next year. And secondly, a much more intensively focused history of public housing in Hong Kong. I'm also going to touch on a few other database-related initiatives at the end if I've got time. In this talk, I want to try to show how the contrasting scope of these two projects led them to have quite different and contrasting methodological requirements. So first of all, the immediately forthcoming book, Mass Housing, which is now in production stage with the publishers and is likely to come out both in paper and online form in March. And this is the draft front cover on the right. This is a global overview history that's got a double focus, modern state and modern architecture, and it tries to tell the story of their interaction on a heroic scale over the past century in generating one of the most ubiquitous patterns of modern urban development, which is the mass housing complex of state-sponsored homes for lower income and some middle-income citizens, especially in tall apartment blocks, and above all in the post-war reconstruction decades, 1945 and 75. So next slide, please. So most dwellings built in the 20th century, of course, simply perpetuated earlier patterns, including like individual private houses and informal dwellings that were built by the inhabitants themselves. Whereas the building complexes that form the subject of this book are quite different. They were shaped less by individual motives than by the collective interventions of the modern state, responding to urgent political and economic pressures. And their often monumental built form broke sharply from the old patterns of the 19th century under the revolutionary influence of the architectural modern movement. Mass housing developments reared up in cities across the world, from Moscow to Buenos Aires, from Stockholm to Singapore, in a vast wave unleashed by the confluence of the strong modern state and modernist architecture. And for half a century, almost all commentaries on this tide of state-sponsored modernization have been agreed on one claim above everything, that it was a phenomenon not just of crushingly high modernist teleological self-will, but also something that was overwhelmingly homogeneous across the world, both architecturally and culturally and socially, not just in the vast expanses of Soviet cities, but equally in Western countries. Now, this book is written from a very different standpoint. It's a history of one of the grandest of all modernist grand narratives, written from a distinctly postmodernist standpoint. Although its overall approach is generally empirical rather than theoretical, it's significantly influenced by the historical concept of multiple modernities, which holds that the recent centuries have been a time not of driving, suffocating homogeneity, but of ever more proliferating unique expressions of modernity. Taking issue with the idea of a single overarching meta-narrative, it argues that modernist mass housing, far from a sort of monochrome desert of uniformity, was a global landscape of very colorful variety and complexity, responding both to the diversity of the 20th century, early 21st century state, and the countless permutations of modernist architecture. Next slide, please. Even the names given to mass housing complexes vary, not only between languages, but between countries. So, for example, in Spanish, polígono is a conjunto habitacional or a barrio in most of Hispanic America, or like in earlier 20th century Puerto Rico, was a caserio. There are innumerable generic titles and designations for mass housing. I mean, in English alone, estate, scheme, project, and so forth. In its emphasis on the local facts on the ground as a foundation for wider trends and narratives, the mass housing book partly takes its cue from recent developments within ancient history. For example, in English, Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell's bottom-up reinterpretation of ancient Mediterranean history around the interactions of what they call micro-regions and microecologies. And you know, what this book tries to do is to adapt that to a 20th century and a global context. Now, in tackling such a vast subject, the book's approach is necessarily highly focused in some ways and very broad brush in others. It doesn't deal, for example, with the experience of mass housing by its inhabitants, which you might think is a very major absence, or it doesn't try to evaluate its success or failure in solving social problems or its moral standing in general. As we'll see, many active house building regimes were distinctly authoritarian or undemocratic in character. I mean, it doesn't directly challenge the tradition of blanket condemnation of modern mass housing. It's something that, for example, in Britain has burst out again following the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire disaster. Can I have the next slide, please? Nor does it attempt to systematically apply the lessons of past social housing experience to future housing policymaking. Its only concern is historical, but within history, it has a very broad scope, which is to provide the first ever global overview of what was built in this vast movement and why, and emphasizing throughout its all-pervasive diversity. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, this has meant an almost exclusive emphasis on secondary sources, mainly in English, but also to some extent in a variety of other European languages. And to tell that rather epic story of global housing production, it's had to broaden out its scope beyond narrow discourses of housing need and architectural form to include a wide range of other topics and forces like the politics of class and social policy, economics, urban planning, demography, engineering and construction, colonialism and post-colonialism, each with its own distinctive methodological challenges. These forces all began to take effect with the emergence of the modern reformist nation state in the late 18th and 19th centuries. In the sociological movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the writings of authors like Marx and Durkheim and Engels and Weber, the state became a sort of depersonalized, but also a dominant idea. Its growing ambition and power then in turn sort of provoked the emerging of distinctive institutions that were functionally differentiated in a typical modernist way, which could intervene in areas of political crisis where the private market was criticized for alleged ineffectiveness, and which then in turn could help to shape the practices of the state and their concrete built outcomes. In the words of Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, quote, "The structural problems of social systems are both the medium and the outcome of the practices that constitute those systems," unquote. Ultimately, state-sponsored low-income housing would exemplify this duality as both an outcome and a vehicle of expanding state power. So, you know, in that sense, this book also reflects the material turn in post-1990s cultural studies, with its emphasis on the role of material infrastructures alongside ideologies and ideas in modern state organization. This is a history not just of discourses or texts, but of massive, literally concrete built reality. Within the housing field, the circular process of mutually reinforcing policies and institutions, as we'll see, began to intensify around the turn of the 20th century. Could I have the next slide, please? Here, a sharp divergence of rhetoric and underlying motives became prominent. Interventions usually started to be advocated in sort of messianic salvation language, ideals like decent housing for all or homes for the people, and promising to satisfy sort of spiritual yearnings as well as material needs. And as the 20th century proceeded, country after country, city after city, developed complex discourses of housing need, combining local polemic with statistical investigations and reports. Actually, probably, yeah, that's right, stick with that one, yeah. And disguising huge disparities behind similar reformist rhetoric rhetoric and disparities which were often just revealed only by unexpected juxtapositions. For example, in 1937, a Manchester housing reformer, E.D. Simon, on a study visit to the Soviet Union, he was very much a kind of advocate normally of garden suburbs and as a, to rehouse slum dwellers and so on. He commented that, quote, 90% of the families in Moscow could improve their housing conditions beyond recognition if they could have for themselves one of those houses that we are pulling down in Manchester as unfit for human habitation, quote. As early as 1899, art critic Theodore Andrea Cook had argued, quote, a nation has no individuality, no single phrase can fairly sum up the characteristics of a people, but a town is like one face picked out of a crowd, unquote. And that civic individuality, in many cases, only became accentuated during the 20th century era of multiple modernities. Could I have the next slide, please? Yet beneath all the lofty rhetoric and the massive housing needs statistics of both the civic and national level, the ruling classes also felt more urgent existential fears of social stability or instability, and the results differed significantly from place to place, but almost always focused on the vital issue of who counted as a full member of society, and which often prioritized the housing of skilled workers rather than the poor, however defined, as a way of securing their loyalty. And mass housing's very political character, both in terms of ideology and action, stemmed above all from this perception of threat. And one of the most enduring housing paradoxes is the fact that for all the talk of fighting injustice, the most effective and long-lasting mass housing programs often focused on somewhat better off citizens, whereas attempts to build directly for the poorest, and especially in the United States, very frequently came to a premature and rather sort of sticky end. Could I have the next slide, please? By the time of World War II, social welfare had become enshrined as an international as well as national policy goal. And the mobilizing rhetoric and the organizational devices of warfare and national emergency pervaded social policy. And one of the leading weapons in the armory of the disciplined, strong state, of the strong city of the 20th century was clearly mass housing. And, it would only be just a slight exaggeration, echoing medieval European history, to call the entire mass housing epic 100 Years' War. A century-long succession of campaigns across the world, prosecuted with military fervor and military ideas of strategic planning, but also shaped on the ground by tactical decision-making and formulating policy opportunistically. In every war, there needs by definition to be an enemy, and mass housing was always sort of shaped by reaction against the other of supposedly bad housing, a contrast that was always emphasized through sort of martial slogans like the war against the slums and that kind of thing. In English-speaking countries, the main enemy was the dilapidated inner urban housing of the industrial era. But in most other developed countries, and for example, in Italy, more often the kind of shanty towns of the urban peripheries were the enemy, and resulting from all the mass rural to urban population influxes of Mediterranean countries. Next slide, please. Alongside all these rather dramatic developments across the world in the political economy of mass housing, a new transnational force in the built environment, which is the modern movement of architecture and planning, was making itself felt in those areas of the built environment claimed by the emergent mass state. This was an architectural ideology which combined an almost Leninist scientific authoritarianism and rationalist authority efficiency doctrines with the poetic prophetic writings and designs of individualistic pioneers and interpreted by the priesthood of Siam. This was an ideology that could seem both utopian and dystopian at the same time. And while the modern movement made sweeping claims about universal applicability, it always combined these with an open embrace of national and local variety and place-specific interpretation. Could I have the next slide, please? so the local diversity of modernism stemmed not from vernacular folk tradition, but from the interaction of professional organized groupings and bodies, including private and publicly employed designers, as well as the growing impact of official institutions and regulations. Now, to take just one random example, in Scandinavia, supposedly one of the most homogeneous regions of the world in its nature-orientated empiricist post-war housing architecture, in fact, the architecture on the ground varied rather hugely from massive arrays of tall towers in Sweden, and the next slide, please, to landscaped, rather lush, low-rise, high density in some developments in Denmark. And then next slide, please. Then the scattered forest blocks in Finland, and then isolated high-density schemes among vast expanses of timber-detached houses in Norway. And next slide, please. And that's a very isolated example. Not many developments like that in Norway. More often individual houses. And then next slide, please. And then finally, all concrete, rather blocky, relatively treeless schemes in Iceland. So really quite a lot of diversity even there. Right now, what I'd like to do now is to go on to the methodological challenges, methodological constraints. So could I have the next slide, please? The very broad scope of the mass housing book poses a number of significant methodological challenges. To begin with, there's the fundamental task of defining its core subject matter and its boundaries. So that's the first bullet point. It's by no means evident how mass housing is to be singled out and differentiated from other categories of housing outside its scope. For example, purely private owner-occupied middle-class apartment blocks, as in your current cross-action research project. Now here, rather than setting down any rigid formula or becoming bogged down in sort of unproductive kind of English language semantic debates about a topic that's intrinsically global and multilingual in character, the book adopts a rather empirical approach that tries to balance its two main themes, the modern state and modern architecture, on a case-by-case basis. So housing programs, including both state agency and modernist architecture, are prioritized. Those that involve neither are excluded, and those in between are dealt with more selectively. The second significant challenge, second bullet point, is about the implications of the book's broad global scope for its choice of source material. And because of that, as I've mentioned before, it's chiefly based on an extensive survey of secondary literature, both in English and also in some other Romance and Germanic languages. And these were supplemented with extensive field work in various parts of the world to give a good feel for what was actually built. Next slide, please. A minority of sections, like those on Hong Kong and Singapore and the UK, have made some significant use of primary sources, as well as interviews with some key actors, and also including, in the case of the interviews, in the Baltic states. Luckily, all this fieldwork and travel-based research was completed in 2019, just before COVID would have brought it all to a halt. So it's a bit of a stroke of luck, timing-wise. The fact that the book's secondary sources are inevitably highly variegated in character inevitably leads to some unevenness in coverage, including a probably excessive emphasis on housing programs in capital cities, which tend to be more overrepresented in secondary material, and also probably an excessive emphasis on the roles of architects and designers, whose names are often publicly documented, as opposed to the sort of official commissioning agencies of housing projects, whose identities are sometimes more difficult to establish. Next slide, please. So going back to the bullet points, and now 3 and 4, if we could just go on to the next slide, to the one with slides. Okay, the book's overall framework of argumentation is also distinctly empirical in character. This is the third bullet point. Whether in politics or in architecture, mass housing deliberately tries to steer away from explicit theoretical or ideological frameworks, instead follows a issue-by-issue approach, constantly offsetting the overall narrative of mass housing against all sorts of local variations. In its architectural coverage too, it avoids elite catchphrases and tries to stress more everyday prosaic aspects of built form, as I'll explain further later. A fourth linked methodological challenge comes from the stress on balancing overarching narrative with local specificity. And particularly, and I can have the next slide, please. Particularly from the fact that most historical accounts of mass housing have tended to confine themselves to individual nation states, leading to a kind of national silo mentality in historical interpretation. Accounts in the United States, for example, are focused on racial politics and stigmatization. And if there was more definition in that map, you'll see it's a sort of housing area thing by race group in Philadelphia at the map in the bottom left. So in France, the histories have tended to focus on the Grand Ensemble and the whole idea, the vision of the Grand Ensemble, which is in the USSR and also its satellites on prefabrication, standardization, Plattenbau in the DDR, and so forth. Could I have the next slide, please? So to counteract that rather unbalanced approach, in this book, the stress on local and national specificity is combined with continuous efforts to correlate these micro-narratives with each other and to identify key transnational themes. The most urgent of these themes obviously was the question of why and for whom mass housing was built in the first place, a question that inspired kind of idealistic justificatory rhetoric of social need alongside pragmatic political motives, and featured huge disparities between individual countries' organizational effectiveness. And it's in that context, balancing local and supranational, that the book's emphasis on the vast local diversity of mass housing should be contextualized. It's an emphasis that applies both organizationally in the variety of state agencies and tenurial approaches involved, and also architecturally in everyday mass housing's highly oblique relationship to canonical or avant-garde modernism and its endless local variety in basic spatial aspects of density, design, and building height. Could I have the next slide, please? So apologies for the rather difficult to read little writing here, but the need to balance the unifying chronological narrative with the stress of geographical diversity has very much structured the arrangement of the sections and the chapters of the book. Overall, it presents mass housing chronologically as a dramatic story, in fact, a kind of epic story, where the first precocious initiatives in a relatively restricted range of developed countries were followed by a general explosion of activity and energy post-1945 in the decades of reconstruction and expansion, decolonization, which is the yellow bit, part B, and the subsequent retrenchment in the old housing heartland. So corresponding to these three phases, part one of the book, which is chapters 1 and 2, is a coordinated narrative of the build-up prior to 1945. Then the quantitatively dominant part 2, which is, chapters right through from 3 to 6 to 15, reflects a much greater breadth of scope in those years through a geographical arrangement of chapters covering the world's chief regions of mass housing production while stressing the particular conditions in each individual nation. And then part C draws a narrative together in the rather more uncertain years after 1989. During the period covered by part 1, the constant alternation of wars and revolutions and so on, and the ideological conflicts between communism, fascism, and so on, both fueled and at times retarded the development of large-scale mass housing, but with a general consensus growing that the old mixed together urban fabric and the private rental housing tenure was obsolete and untenable. Next slide, please. In some cases, dramatically contrasting approaches followed one another in quick succession in the same location, all equally expressive of modernity in their own way. So, for example, in Red Vienna, the boldly innovative municipal housing drive in the 20s, then followed immediately by the conservative Austro-fascist regime of 1935 to 8, which was a sort of modernity in its own right, and then followed by the Anschluss with Germany, or the strong swing from state intervention to the private market around 1928 to 30 in countries like the Netherlands or Denmark or Britain. In other cases, there were striking simultaneous contrasts, like in the coincidence of the European dictatorships of the later 30s with the democratic state interventionism of Sweden or the United States. Next slide, please. And then just going back to have a quick check of more of the table of contents, only after World War II had discredited fascist totalitarianism did a new geopolitical structure of social provision emerge, with communism emerging as a kind of hegemonic doctrine, a structure where mass housing played a very exemplary role. The new framework, most famously summed up in 1952 by social critic Alfred Sauvy in an echo of the French 18th century Three Estates, by interpreting the developed world through a binary opposition between the first world of Western capitalists and the second world of communist bloc, and then defining by its otherness in relation to these two groupings the third world of developing and non-aligned states, a category now very much inflated by the post-war collapse of the European empires. The arrangement of part two reflects this well-known structure in a rather obvious geographical way, but also through a kind of subtle internal narrative of the post-war mass housing drive, because the first world programs, which are the chapters 3 to 9, somewhat preceded those of the second and the third. There's relatively little overlap at all, for example, between the main phase of public housing in the United States, which was already kind of waning in the 50s, and in the Soviet Union, or for example in Hong Kong, where production was only seriously getting underway during the same period. So the chapter order within the post-war part 2, or part B rather, reflects not just global geography, but also this internal global chronology of the post-war era, within which the welfare states of Western Europe fall fairly neatly in the middle. Part B also, though, highlights the significant geopolitical subdivisions and anomalies within this structure, including the splits within the First World and the Second World between American anti-socialist and European welfare state approaches, and between different branches of socialism, like Soviet versus Yugoslav, etc., etc. Overall, though, as mass housing was intrinsically a discourse and a practice of organized modernity, significant mass housing programs were overwhelmingly concentrated in the first and second worlds, which inevitably, therefore, dominate part 2 and, indeed, mass housing as a whole. So it does become essentially a book very much dominated by the global north, although the global north and global south, the concept that are slightly later than I think the first, second, and third worlds are more kind of contemporary labels to the subject matter. Contrary to all the later claims of top-down homogeneity, by the 60s, almost all the existing states of the first and second worlds had developed their own distinctive patterns of social provision and housing production. Multiple institutional and ideological patterns energized by strong state control and new collective values, which obviously in the second world focused on communist social engineering, and in the first world, what one could call soft nationalism, reacting in the European case against fascist concepts of national essence. But in all cases, the underlying agenda being to use housing to define membership of the imagined community of national society, and with the results in each country varying radically, and not just each country, but also within cities. Next slide, please. Because within these national structures, as I've suggested already, a further layer of micro-regional diversity came from the semi-autonomous status of key cities like Moscow or London or New York, and the considerable power of even the lesser urban centers. Western countries' recipes of mass housing production usually involve what were called special circuits of state-supported housing finance, and place specific balances of capital and labor in the state. Behind the public rhetoric of housing need and social solidarity, many mass housing campaigns with their language of combat and power were bound up with authoritative patriarchal social structures and strategies of forcible intervention or segregation, including, of course, residential zoning by race or social class. Next slide, please. But this still permitted a wide variety of financing and organizational regimes. Now, on the one hand, these included, probably the dominant was what you could call arm's length agencies, either private or philanthropic or cooperative agencies that enjoyed state support, often indirectly via taxation concessions and that kind of stuff. And so the state is very much at arm's length there, or sort of semi-arm's length, public agencies that were not directly part of governmental bodies, things like the HEPs in Italy or the HLM in France. You know, these are not directly part of like a ministry or something like that. But then in the Anglophone countries, particularly, and if we could have the next slide, please, there's a system where mass housing was, on the whole, dealt with by direct agencies of the state itself. Some of these could be like area-based national bodies, and we'll see in Hong Kong in a second. That's they could be regional bodies, like in Australia, for example. Or in Britain, there's what's called council housing, and the name actually comes from the institution where municipalities directly build and own and rent out the dwellings. Now, obviously, in some other countries, there's some council housing, and I'm very aware in many Italian cities, there's a proportion of housing that's built municipally and by the comune. Likewise, in Sweden, you do get some places that have municipal housing, but it's only really in Britain that it became a kind of national system that was really assumed to apply everywhere. And then finally, a final system that's in the USSR was sort of functionally based efforts. That's with the housing projects directly built by government factories and enterprises under state socialism. Maybe we could just go back to the previous slide. Just that. Thanks, Lovin. There was also constant debate about the optimum targeting of state-led housing campaigns. You know, who should be the recipient? There had to be a balance of affordability and ethical prioritization between the poorest citizens, who were often displaced through coercive clearances or squatter settlement fires, and middling income groups that could cover more of their housing costs. And obviously, with your cost research project, that's the latter are very much the focus of that. Very often in the Anglophone countries, the housing for the poor and for people displaced in slum clearance is very much clearly and separately defined. The political place of mass housing in the First and Second Worlds ranged from unquestioned security as an institution, especially in the socialist bloc, to extreme precariousness, as in the United States in the 1950s under McCarthyism, when there was a push to, rather like, today Trump's rhetoric against socialism and et cetera, that it was the very idea was hyper politicized. But the left and right often fed off one another. And with, for example, doctrines like the Catholic-dominated Christian democracy, parrying the appeal of socialism through their own social programs, and then, on the other hand, communism trying to appropriate capitalist organizational ideologies like Fordist hierarchical mass production. Next slide, please. Architecturally, too, as I suggested earlier, like with Scandinavia, individual countries very much developed their own variants of the supposedly universal formulae of international modernism. The most pressing, though, were basic choices of building patterns, like between high apartment blocks and single-family dwellings, or between whether you build on the city peripheries, as in most European countries, or surgical slum clearance in inner cities, as in mainly in the Anglophone countries. Post-war mass housing architecture was, of course, shaped by the avant-garde design and planning concepts of modernist pioneers, especially Corbusier and the younger Team 10 grouping, with all their advocacy of like dense cluster, megastructural planning, etc., etc. But I think, you know, we have to beware of excessive reification of architectural creativity in this field. Far more significant were relatively impersonal contextual factors like land control, density pressures, or building industry organization. On the ground, the multiple modernities of mass housing architecture simplified and mixed together the main elite concepts, and especially tall towers in open space, in countless local permutations. Could I have the next slide, please? For example, I mean, many of them actually perpetuated elements from pre-modernist phases of housing, including, for example, what it was called in the Soviet Union the sectional plan, which was like repetitive, the division of linear blocks into repetitive units with a single staircase and apartments coming off it on each side, adapted from 19th century middle-class tenements into a kind of infinitely extensible formula that was very much ubiquitous in the USSR. Or on the other hand, this example here, the external gallery access blocks in London of like philanthropic slum dwellings in the 19th century, which then lay behind the all the different variants of gallery access or balcony access in the 20th century, and including the kind of more avant-garde fancy version, like the deck access and the Smithsons and you know, that sort of stuff, but also, you know, rather more basic things like these home ownership blocks in Singapore from the 60s in this case. And then obviously the absolute home of gallery access was the Netherlands in the post-war period under the term Galerijbouw. The book has very copious color illustrations. There's over like 1,000 illustrations, most of them specifically taken for this book on field trips across the world since 2010, provide a visual overview of this incredible diversity, and both architecturally and in policy terms, part B of the book constitutes an exercise in micro history as much as global macro history. Now, these strong local micro-regional specificities, though, as I've suggested before, were played out against the backdrop of many common regional features or commonalities of organization and architecture. And these aggregated subdivisions are reflected in the chapter arrangement within Part B, which many of which group together several countries that have common features, but common features which, you know, I think only accentuate the individuality of the countries and cities. And I'm not just talking about architecture, but about organization and the political aspects. So now, can I have the next slide, please? So we already touched on the architectural variety of the Scandinavian countries against the common welfare background and the strength of the co-op tradition. But the same arguably applies to the Low Countries, where the common social organization, a rather different sort of social organization, in what were called pillars or pillarization, in Dutch verzuiling, which was the organization of society into sectarian groupings of Catholics, socialists, Protestants, and so on. In the Netherlands, highlighted the difference between laissez-faire Belgium on the left and planned Netherlands. They're both pillarized countries in their social organization, but very radically different on the issue of individualism versus planned order in the organization of the built environment and in the form of the built environment. And you can see there with Belgium with kind of higgledy-piggledy things and this next to that and so on. Could I have the next slide, please? And then in the so-called Anglosphere of the English-speaking countries like USA, Australia, New Zealand, and with Britain, which shared very significant policy preferences, especially for mass slum clearance. The idea that the target of the bad housing, the enemy housing, was in the middle of cities, and the arrangement under what the sort of Chicago school model of the city, under where it's assumed that the bad areas are in the kind of belt immediately around the CBD sort of thing, and with posh, expensive areas outside that, as you know, the reverse of many continental countries. So you have to carve out areas in the center, and it's slum clearance and demolition and etc. But also the preference for these kind of central organizational these central organizations like housing commissions, or the Ministry of, this one is here, you can see at the bottom left here, the Ministry of Housing and Construction Estate. That's the Ministry of Housing and Construction of the state of Victoria in Australia. Those are some of the estates that have been quarantined recently. And also in some Anglophone countries, not so much in Britain or in Ireland, a very strong preference for state-promoted home ownership as well. And then could I have the next slide, please? And then in the second world, the closest satellites of the USSR and places like Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia significantly resembled one another. First, in their partly architecturally, in their somewhat expansive urbanist, spaced out urbanist approach, but also in the balance between building by functional organizations and a strong emphasis intermittently on, might sound rather surprising, but the involvement of co-ops and semi sort of voluntaristic organizations, which then contrasted quite strongly with other neighbors like Yugoslavia and Romania, which were diverging from that very much in opposite directions. Towards, in the case of Yugoslavia on the right, extreme organizational and architectural individualism, and then in the case of Romania, increasingly a sort of traditionalism and of densification around boulevard, sort of neo-boulevard planning. Commonalities were also fostered by cross-cutting international ideologies like socialist mutual assistance or Americanization. The idea of Americanization obviously was very much debated in general public discourse in Western Europe, and yet you could say, well, in some ways it was surprisingly restricted in actual effect, you know, mainly in dwelling interiors and so-called mod cons. The international effects of decolonization were two-way in character, with the export of development aid to newly emancipated countries being mirrored in the repatriation of colonial expertise. As the chapter on these countries shows, that continuing interdependence and the relative weakness of many newly independent states made sure that the large-scale mobilization process needed for mass housing only came together relatively rarely in the Third World, as well as in some hybrid post-colonial societies like Israel or Kuwait. Could I have the next slide, please? In two parts of the world, in Latin America and capitalist Eastern Asia, distinctive region-wide housing patterns that were significantly different from the mainstream First World and Second World housing patterns emerged. And so they've each got a separate chapter near the end of Part B. In Latin America, these special patterns were shaped by the frequent alternation of authoritarian and democratic regimes, the pervasiveness of anti-communism, other than in Cuba, and the addiction to spectacular, rather gestural housing campaigns. And then, could I have the next slide, please? And then in Eastern Asia, they were shaped by the essentially Japanese invention of a new formula of state-directed developmental capitalism, which then spread to a number of other places. And even although Japan didn't build very, very massive mass housing complexes, some other places, as we will see in a second, did. The cases of Hong Kong and Singapore saw the housing power of the individual city or city-state reach an all-time maximum, but avoiding the welfare state social entitlement policies that went with high state activism and high organization in both the First World and the Second Worlds. In all of these places, and in the Third World proper, state housing initiatives were shadowed not only by the traditional bogeyman other of self-built informal housing, but also by a variant of self-built housing that was sanctioned by international officialdom, and which was the so-called aided self-help doctrine, which is very much promoted by international agencies as a more individualistic alternative to public rental housing, and which was very significantly shaped by American anti-socialism and the role of US officials in international development agencies. Could I have the next slide, please? In both the First and Second Worlds, social housing programs' very impact eventually, arguably, undermined their political support and made them vulnerable to opposition and protests, especially after the 1968 Western upheavals and the 1989 to 91 revolution in the socialist bloc. And each country had its own narrative. Here's the one in Sweden, for example. Next slide, please. And from that point, as the part C of the book shows, mass housing complexes became a lightning rod for wider critiques of progress-led modernity, and as destruction, catastrophes, gradually sort of pulled down their reputation, along with more general residualization in Western countries. And accusations of top-down alienating sameness in the former First and Second Worlds became universal in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Could I have the next slide, please? And that's even as the new Eastern Asian front in the 100 Years' War heated up further, and although not infused with the same utopian reformist spirit as their 20th century predecessors, the 21st century programs of countries like Singapore, South Korea, China, or Turkey, and could I have the next slide, please? These programs revived and even accentuated the strong state formula, while intensifying and sort of shifting the modernist architectural formula of mass apartment construction in new ultra high density ways of really, blocks that were crammed together much more in much more concentrated and arguably repetitive ways than in some of the even in the Soviet Union. Although there are doubts about the reality of the achievements trumpeted in some cases, although TOKİ in Turkey is somewhere as an organization that certainly has publicly, very much publicly published documentation of its work, but in China, obviously the issue is slightly, it's not quite clear what has actually been really built. And obviously, although the old idea of the benevolent state seems quite remote in places like this, at the very least, these efforts seem to belie the assumption that the only remaining housing options in the 21st century are unaffordable free market home ownership housing in rich countries and aided self-help in poor countries. Today, the concept of state-led progress in housing now seems to be back on the agenda, albeit in the distinctly different form of, as Mark Swinnerton put it, welfare state building without the welfare state. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the mention of Hong Kong, and this is just the final maybe 5 or 10 minutes of the 10 minutes of the lecture. The mention of Hong Kong brings me on to my second book, A History of Public Housing in Hong Kong, which I finished researching and I'm now writing the first few chapter drafts for. This is a completely different kind of project. It's focused on a single small territory and looking at great detail at the decision-making processes and architectural patterns of its housing program. Could I have the next slide, please? Methodologically, this has required a combination of research in government files, very intense research over a number of years in the Hong Kong Public Records Office, and combined with intensive fieldwork visits to all Hong Kong public housing estates, and some of which can be seen out of the window from the search room there, and also just immediately opposite the Public Records Office in the bottom left. And also interviews with a large number of key actors stretching back to really even the early post-war period, but especially in the 70s and 80s. Could I have the next slide, please? Here's a glimpse of some of the research material available in the Public Record Office, including those masses of government files on a vast range of policy and planning issues. And this is these are the one on the right is about flat sizes and in relation to density and so on. I could have the next slide, please. And there's lots of other material like newspaper cuttings, government information bulletins, plans of housing estates, project progress documentation you can see on the bottom there. Again, luckily, all this research was already in the bag when the COVID travel curtain came clanging down. Next slide, please. Now, in Hong Kong, state-built mass housing is seen at its most urgent and existential. I mean, if mass housing in general in the 20th century was about, particularly about existential pressures and national identity, civic identity, Hong Kong is it. There it played a key role in helping a largely laissez-faire social and economic system cope with strong external emergency pressures of a geopolitical rather than socio-political kind, concerned with state survival, sovereignty, pressures that of course continue today. In Hong Kong, the now over 60 years old mass housing programs of the program of the Government Housing Authority and its predecessors. Could I have the next slide, please? Although on the surface, explicitly non-ideological, in reality was always driven by far more urgent underlying pressures than those of the sort of orthodox European welfare state, namely the territory's barely tolerated status as a capitalist enclave attached to post-1949 communist China, swamped by refugees from that system, and then underlying all this, subject to a fundamental existential threat from the impending reversion of the sovereignty of most of its territory to communist China in 1997. So in response, the narrative of Hong Kong mass housing proceeded in somewhat convulsive leaps. Could I have the next slide, please? In the 1950s, the driving force was an emergency utilitarian developmental drive of high-density tenements following squatter fires and focused on rehousing displaced squatters to clear development land. Next slide, please. That's some more images of the very, very high density sort of utilitarian tenements that were built in the 50s, and the ultra high density you can see at the top there. But by the late 60s and early 70s, following growing political unrest, a more socially interventive government policy, including a large-scale building of modernist flats, many for subsidized home ownership, and planned towns became necessary. Could I have the next slide, please? The aim was to anchor an increasingly unstable and disaffected society, but one which lacked the independence option, which was normally applied in British decolonization. Decisive here was Hong Kong's most innovative reformist governor, Sir Murray Maclehose, who was governor from 1971 to 82, and the governor was like an appointed king of the territory, who really wasn't a democracy, but it was one where there was freedom of expression, rather like today. What the government files show is that Maclehose was very well aware of the existential role of public housing. In a secret dispatch of 1974 to the Foreign Secretary in London, he said that Hong Kong's colonial rulers must not, quote, make a mess of things, unquote, which could provoke an early Chinese takeover, but they should instead use what he called the breathing space before 1997 to get a move on and make Hong Kong a, quote, model city, including a radical upgrading of its housing standards. Can I have the next slide, please? And following McLehoz's launch of a dramatic 10-year program of public housing in 1972, which was steered by the head of the Housing Authority, architect Donald Liao, who's here, Housing Authority architects responded to the severe shortage of land in the territory by a rapidly increasing stress on high towers. And the combination of the government files and interviews with key actors has vividly highlighted all the details of the most important policy debates in those years. The 30-year rule for government file access, which is the same as in Britain, means that for the years after 1990, though, different sources have to be looked up from including, for example, local newspapers in the Hong Kong Central Library. Under Liao and his successors, the Housing Authority took up the typical British 1950s fashion for slender so-called point blocks and expanded it into a huge scale. Could I have the next slide, please? And this established 41 stories in the late 1980s as a norm for most blocks, whether in new towns or in redevelopments of earlier public housing or squatter settlements in the existing urban cores. Housing Authority or Housing Department tower block types evolved progressively towards highly articulated cruciform plan or tripod models to maximize density. And the most prolifically built of these standard blocks was the Harmony block, as it was called. Could I have the next slide, please? And the Harmony was a 41-story block that was intended both for rental and also for subsidized home ownership use, and was designed in 1987 to 9 under the expat chief housing architect Derek Messling in a range of variants that was designed to allow different permutations of flat numbers and sizes, up to 20 flats per floor. So a block like that would have 800 flats in the block. But while the architectural character of the housing program has essentially stabilized since the 90s and wasn't greatly affected by the 1997 handover to China and the setting up of the so-called one country, two systems regime, its wider political context continues to be subject to the same existential pressures as ever over Hong Kong's sovereignty and geopolitical situation. Could I have the next slide, please? In the current crisis, with its discontent at the perceived erosion of one country, two systems, and now the National Security Bill or law, the role of public housing is still an uncertain and contentious one. On the one hand, the social infrastructures built up from the McLehoz years onwards, including public rental housing, home ownership, scheme, have done a lot to build up the feeling of Hong Kong as a home rather than as a glorified transit camp, feelings that underlie a lot of the present political discontent. Next slide, please. But also, there is a strong practical feeling across society that housing, especially for the young, has become impossibly unaffordable. Now, obviously, I think we should emphasize that Western-style discontent at supposedly alienating mass high-rise blocks is not involved in this at all. Nobody is unhappy with the built forms of what is being produced. Just that people say there's far too little being built and and it costs far too much. All the blocks visible in these pictures are public housing blocks, and not in any way criticized for their built form at all. Could I have the next slide, please? But at any rate, what we can definitely say is that public housing's role in the hot seat of Hong Kong's existential sovereignty crisis seems set to continue. And so it could well be that this book, although it's purely historical in scope and originally conceived as a bit of a niche topic of mainly specialist historical interest, now in today's climate might be received as being a bit controversial in touching on controversial aspects of Hong Kong public debate at the moment. And we'll obviously have to wait and see about that. Next slide, please. So finally, my last slide, there are a number of other current projects I can't really do more than touch on, which are not directly publication linked and don't have any underlying theoretical or ideological slant. Projects that are really basically concerned with compiling databases or image banks on mass housing, usually as part of a range of government-sponsored documentation or community outreach projects. Although these are not necessarily fully fledged research as such, they can in turn potentially feed future research projects. So for example, this database here on this screen of all post-war public housing high-rise flats in Britain, called Tower Block UK, together with transcriptions of dozens of interviews with key actors, so like politicians and architects and so on, that I did in the 80s, is providing a lot of material for potentially a book on post-war mass housing in London that I'm beginning to scope out as a potentially more manageable research project in the new age of seemingly restricted international travel. But that's, of course, another story. So that's, thank you very much.